Hi everyone, my name is Nuslatine, and in this presentation, I will be reflecting on my learning journey in the media and politics minor. The main theme that shaped my experience is that media is a space where power, meaning, and identity are shaped. At the beginning of the minor, I saw media mostly as a way to share information or entertainment. But over time, through my courses and projects, I began to see that media does much more than communicate events. It shapes how events are understood, whose voices become visible, and what meanings become accepted. Before this minor, I followed sports and used social media without thinking much about the systems behind it. I didn't ask who was shaping messages or why some stories were more visible than others. Over time, I realized media doesn't just deliver information, it shapes what people notice, how they interpret events, and what they believe matters. This shift is what made this minor meaningful for me. The biggest idea I took away from this minor is that media does not simply communicate politics, it helps shape political meaning. Media influences which voices are heard, which identities are recognized, and which narratives become accepted as normal or believable. Across different courses, I kept seeing the same pattern. Whether the topic was youth media, sports law, or digital diplomacy, they all showed that media actively shapes political and social reality. This is why my presentation is organized around three key concepts: representation, regulation, and digital platforms. At the beginning of the minor, I focused mostly on content. I cared about what messages were saying and whether they were interesting or persuasive. But I didn't think much about how those messages were structured or why they appear in certain ways. Over time, I began to understand that media does not simply present reality, it frames it. The way something is framed influences how audiences interpret it. Now, I think more about framing, power, and visibility when I engage with media. In this presentation, I'll explain this idea through three main concepts: representation, regulation, and digital platforms. Then I'll connect these ideas to a real-world example, which is digital diplomacy during COVID-19, to show how these concepts work together in practice. The first concept is representation, which refers to how media presents people, communities, and identities. It shapes who becomes visible, how they're described, and what kinds of narratives are repeated. Because of this, it's not neutral, it's shaped by power. This became clear in my African youth media course, where I studied how youth are often represented in simplified or negative ways in mainstream media, not even though they're active participants in culture and politics. This shows me that representation shapes how groups are understood and whose voices are heard. One of the strongest examples of this for me was my work on Afrobeat music and Nigerian youth. In that project, I focused on how artists like Fela Kuti used music not just for entertainment, but as a way to speak about power, corruption, inequality, and resistance. In African youth media, the final project itself was a multimedia digital publication, which encouraged us to critically analyze an example of African popular media and connect it to course themes such as youth, politics, and media flows. That structure helped me take my example more seriously and see it as part of a larger media and political context. Before this project, I saw media mainly as personal or a cultural expression. Studying Afrobeat showed me that media can also be political. It can express frustration, highlight inequality, and challenge authority. It changed how I see representation, not just as how others portray people, but how people represent themselves and push back against dominant narratives. This connects the idea of identity, which I came to understand as something shaped through media rather than fixed. When groups are shown in limited ways, it shapes how audiences understand them. But when they can create their own media, they can challenge those narratives. This shows that visibility is not enough. How people are represented also matters. This same idea became more personal to me through sports because I've always enjoyed sports as a person. Before this minor, I mostly saw sports as competition and entertainment. I followed it because I liked it, not because of what I thought it was. But in my communication and sports course, I started to see sports media very differently. I learned that sports media is not just about games, teams, or athletes. It also reflects politics, identity, nationalism, race, gender, and global image. Sporting events are often presented as neutral or unifying, but the way they're covered frames how audiences understand countries, cultures, and social issues. Media coverage does not only show the event itself, it shapes the narratives around the event and tells audiences how to interpret what they're seeing. This mattered to me because it connected my personal interests to my academic work. It made the minor feel more meaningful. I realized that something I already cared about could also be studied seriously as a site of power and political meaning. The second concept is regulation, which refers to laws and institutional systems that shape media. In my media politics and intellectual property law course, I learned that media is not completely free. It operates within structures that shape what can be shared, what's protected, and what's restricted. Before this course, I saw freedom of expression in a simple way, but I learned that it's always shaped by political and legal systems. Power in media often operates through rules, ownership, and institutional pressure, not just direct censorship. This showed me that control over media can be subtle but very powerful. The third concept is digital platforms, which I explored in my digital diplomacy course. This course helped me understand that digital platforms are not just places where information is posted, they're strategic spaces where governments, organizations, and institutions communicate with global audiences, shape narratives, and respond to crises in real time. What stood out to me in this course is that diplomacy no longer happens only behind closed doors. It also happens online, publicly, and in real time. Social media became a major space where credibility, reputation, and political influence are negotiated. That helped me understand how media and politics now operate together very visibly on digital platforms. One key idea here is algorithmic bias, which is how platforms promote content based on engagement. Content that gets more likes or shares become more visible, which often favors emotional or divisive content. This means digital media does not just reflect reality, it shapes what becomes visible and influential. A clear example that brought all of these ideas together for me was my digital diplomacy paper during COVID-19, especially how organizations like the World Health Organization used Twitter to shape public understanding during a global crisis. In my final paper, I looked at how the WHO used Twitter to share health information, correct false claims, and encourage cooperation across borders. It used hashtags like healthy at home and solidarity, along with infographics, short videos, and simple public messages that were designed to be easy to share. At first, I understood this mainly as an informational campaign, but when I studied it more carefully, I saw that it was also about image, trust, credibility, and political influence. This was one of the most important assignments I did in the minor, because it allowed me to apply the concept I had learned to a real global crisis. This example showed me that communication is not separate from power. The WHO relied on soft power, meaning influence through trust rather than force. At the same time, platform dynamics and political conflict shaped how people responded. Misinformation spread quickly, and political tension reduced trust. This shows that media is a space where meaning, trust, and authority are constantly shaped and contested. Overall, this minor changed how I approach media. I now pay more attention to how messages are constructed, whose voices are included, and what shapes visibility. One key shift for me is understanding that visibility is not neutral, but influenced by power. This minor connected my academic learning to my personal interests and made the experiences more meaningful. Most importantly, it made me more aware of responsibility. Since media shapes public understanding, I now engage with it more thoughtfully. Overall, this minor showed me that media does not just reflect public life, it shapes it. and this understanding will shape my future in communication and media-related work. Thank you.